There were times when I looked at my reporting and wondered, whether the sprawling story with all these wild characters could possibly be true. I found really more than I ever imagined I would.
Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 90. How was the forgery of the Gospel of Jesus' wife confirmed? In the previous 3 episodes of the NT Pod, we've been looking at the extraordinary story of the Gospel of Jesus' wife. First of all, how it was released in 2012, how lots of people thought it was extraordinarily exciting for the insight that it gave on Christian origins. And we looked at the extent to which it became clear fairly early on that this seemed to be some kind of forgery, and explored how it appeared to copy from the Gospel of Thomas, not just from the Gospel of Thomas, but from the one extant Coptic text of the Gospel of Thomas. And not just that, but a version of it that appeared on the internet, typos and all. And then we looked at the extraordinary circumstance that the owner of the Gospel of Jesus' wife also provided a translation that turned out to be an Interlinear, which copied elements that were in the Interlinear online. I don't know if you followed this story so far. It has so many twists and turns that, frankly, it's quite difficult getting it into even 4 episodes of the NT Pod, but I'm doing my best with it. In this final episode on the Gospel of Jesus' wife, it gets stranger still. And that's because most of our attention in the early days of the Gospel of Jesus' wife being around was focused on the content, things like the grammar, the paleography, that kind of thing, but also on the material. So Harvard spent a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of energy, quite reasonably, putting work into carbon dating the fragment and looking at chemical analyses of the ink. And neither of those things proved forgery. What they did is showed that the papyrus itself was quite ancient, even though it was much later than it ought to have been. But what we haven't done yet is looked seriously at the provenance. And provenance is always important, especially when you get to items that suddenly turn up one day. If a tall, dark stranger just turns up one day with something extraordinary, the first thing one wants to ask him or her is, where did you get it from? And is there any kind of trail? Is there any kind of documentation? Can you show us where this came from? Now, there was a journalist named Owen Jarvis who was working for Life Science, and he was already doing some really interesting digging. One of the things that he decided to do was to look at the name of the person who is said to be the previous owner of the fragment, a certain H.U. Laukamp. I mentioned him in episode 87. He was said to have obtained the Gospel of Jesus' wife from Potsdam in East Germany in 1963. Now, Laukamp is not a name known to scholars, and some people just thought, well, who is this guy? I mean, private collectors pop up all over the place, so there's no reason we should have known him, but it was still an interesting question. Who is this guy? Is he a real person, or is he perhaps some kind of fictional person? Well, it turns out he was definitely a real person. Jarvis found that he was actually a tool worker from Germany and who did spend some time in Florida. Laukamp died in 2002, so he couldn't be interviewed. But what Jarvis did is he started looking for Laukamp's relatives, representatives, this kind of thing, and immediately he began to find that there were certain suspicious things going on. Laukamp, for example, turned out to be completely uninterested in antiquities. His representative said, no, this was not the kind of person that he was. Moreover, Laukamp wasn't even in East Germany in 1963. He was in West Germany at this stage. And this is Cold War days, and it may be that it wasn't that easy to go over to East Germany to go and get a bit of antiquity for somebody who wasn't really interested in antiquities. And you know what? There was already a worrying sign. In Ariel Sabar's Smithsonian Magazine article, which he wrote in 2012, right at the beginning of the whole business, he noted that one of the emails to Karen King had a completely different story. It wasn't from East Germany in 1963, but it had been in Laukamp's family prior to World War II. So which one of these was right? That itself really ought to have been a warning sign, a red flag to all of us, because you can't have a provenance story just changing midway through the person telling you where it was from. But so far these things were only suggestive. And this was just April 2014 when Owen Jarras was doing this work, just as Harvard Theological Review was putting out their issue saying that scientific tests had finally proved that the piece was authentic. Now somebody else that I've already mentioned was doing some digging at the same time. And his name is Ariel Sabar. He was one of the first 3 authors who were involved with the publicity for the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. The other ones were writing for the Boston Globe and the New York Times, but Sabar was writing for the Smithsonian magazine. Remember that Smithsonian had a TV documentary out on the Gospel of Jesus' Wife as well. So Ariel Sabar had met Karen King back then in September 2012 and had been able to ask her lots of questions. He was also the only journalist from those original 3 who was with Karen King in Rome when the public announcement went out. So he was very well situated to do some more digging on this. And it's worth saying as well, and I'm not just being sycophantic here, because I like Ariel Sabar, but he is a really first-class investigative journalism. And also he has this marvellous writing style that is so compelling that, I tell you, if you haven't read the article already, and the link, of course, will be in the show notes, just like the links to all the other materials, if you haven't read it already, you've got a real treat in store. And if you're the kind of person that likes listening to stuff, which you probably are if you're listening to the NT pod, you can get the piece read out to you on the Smithsonian website. It's there available for free. It takes about an hour and a quarter for the piece to be read out. And there's also a nice clip of Ariel Sabar himself talking through some of the aspects of his discovery. Here's a first clip of it.
There was this one sort of area or line of investigation that no one had ever really looked at deeply, and that was the question of provenance. And provenance is sort of a fancy way of saying, where does an object come from? What are its origins? Who are the chain of owners that had this object? Who took it out of the ground initially? Who owned it before it came to Karen King? And as far as I could tell, Karen King herself had made no independent investigation of that. She took the owner's word, more or less, and that's kind of where she leaves it. 3 years after the story first breaks, I decide to start digging and not really sure what I'm going to find because, I figured after 3 years, the ground had probably been so heavily raked over that if there was anything explosive to learn about the owner, who he was, we would have already heard about it. I found that was absolutely not the case. I started doing what journalists do all the time, digging through public records. I started cultivating sources, following one lead to another, often encountering dead ends, but ultimately discovering this really wild tale about the owner, not only identifying the owner, but meeting with him and finding that he was this very complex, fascinating figure whose life intersected with the worlds of Egyptology, with the worlds of porn, who had kind of popped up almost Zelig-like in a million different places.
Now, I'm not going to read the entire story. I'm not going to try and retell it in my own words because Sabar tells it so well in his Atlantic article. Now, the article came out in July, August 2016, and I'll just give you some highlights so that you can get an idea of how extraordinary it is. He finds out that Laukamp had been in business with a certain Walter Fritz. And this Walter Fritz, it also turns out, was at Free University in Berlin in the early 1980s and published an article on Egyptology. He was a man who had the knowledge, the background to put together something like the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, but also he was able to put together the associated documentation. Remember that there was a letter from a certain Professor Munro to Laukamp that mentioned another guy called Fecht, and it's worth noting that Fritz took a class with Munro, so he knew the characters that are mentioned in the documentation that he provided. So it was all beginning to add up. But of course, whenever you do any of this kind of work, so much of the evidence is going to be circumstantial. But then Ariel Sabar found out that he had registered the domain name www.gospelofjesuswife.com wait for it, in August 2012, several weeks before the announcement. So he clearly had prior knowledge of the thing. But we haven't got to the strangest bit of all yet. Nobody, I don't think, expected this to turn into a story about porn. And I hate to mention it, first time it's ever been mentioned on the NT pod, and probably the last. But it really is one of the most strange elements in the whole story. What happened is Fritz and his wife were involved for some years in the porn business. They had videos and all the rest of it being released. And one of the things that they did is they claimed something a little bit more than just everyday satisfaction of people's lusts and all the rest of it. What they tried to do was suggest that there was a spiritual element to their pornography and that there was a kind of learned element to it. Here's a line from Sabar's article. The juxtaposition of lewd and learned appears in still sharper relief on one of Fritz's wife's sites, where passages from Goethe, Proust and Edna St. Vincent Millay are interspersed with philosophical musings on Jesus' teachings, the slippery nature of reality and the perfection of sluthood. I do apologise for having to speak like this. He goes on, this is Sabar. I wondered whether Fritz and his wife had seen in the book a way to sanctify their adventurous sex life, to cloak it in the garb of faith. The couple launched their first porn site in April 2003, a month after the Da Vinci Code was published. Perhaps they'd spun a fantasy of Fritz, whose birthday happens to be Christmas, as a kind of Jesus figure, and his wife as a latter-day Mary Magdalene. Moreover, Fritz's wife wrote a book in 2015 called Universal Truths, in which she suggested that she was doing divinely inspired automatic writing under the guidance of God. And it's also the case that there were various strange artifacts that Fritz and his wife had for sale. I actually knew the name before Ariel Sabar had released it because a couple of people had put two and two together as well, though nobody had worked out all the stuff that Ariel Sabar had done. And on their website, you could actually see certain things that bore uncanny resemblances to elements in the whole Gospel of Jesus' Wife fiasco. And I'll put in the show notes a blog post from Christian Askeland that isolates some of the strange items that made it look very suspicious from early on. Now, Sabar approached Fritz, and initially he categorically denied being the owner. Let's go again to a clip of Sabar talking about the next stage of his investigation.
When I first called him during my first trip to Florida in November, he denied everything. He denied being the owner. He denied, ever studying at the Free University. He denied really having anything more than a passing relationship with the previous owner. Knew really nothing about anything. So it took my going to Germany and compiling basically a kind of dossier on him, and then calling him back months later and saying, hey, this is what I found, now can we talk? Then all of a sudden he becomes very, very open, and we have something like a total of 22 hours of conversations about the papyrus and about his own history. Now you're learning that the owner is not this hapless collector who doesn't read Coptic and has stumbled upon this document and doesn't really know what it is, but he actually was a former student of Coptic who's very, very well read in Christian history, he's very, very well read in ancient history, and when he acknowledged to me that he had lied to Karen King about certain details. It's one thing to lie to a reporter, it's another thing to lie to a Harvard professor who you are asking to introduce your papyrus to the world.
And so what we end up with is a photograph of Fritz and this lengthy interview and fascinating insights from the person that all along had owned the papyrus. I don't think Fritz had a very high opinion of the people who were claiming it was a forgery. There's one kind of hilarious quotation from him in the article where he talks about scholars from the University of Eastern PP land as when he's referring to those that have attempted to expose the thing as forgery. So he clearly didn't have a lot of time for people like Christian Askeland or Andrew Bernhard, I suspect. But what we have here is, in some senses, a conclusion to the whole story. That's not to say there won't be other things that happen, but I think we reach a point here where we have a conclusion. Ariel Sabar ends the article by noting one interesting final twist, which is that he says Walter Fritz asked him if he would like to go into collaboration with him on another project and do something on the Mary Magdalene story, all about the suppression of a female element in the church, which does sound a little bit like the Da Vinci Code, doesn't it? And it does sound like something that isn't a million miles away from the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, to bring us right back to that first point. So what happened next? There was pretty much universal acceptance after this that, after all, the Gospel of Jesus' Wife was a forgery, even including Karen King herself, who very graciously said that she thought that this tipped the balance towards forgery. And in fact, she took the initiative and called Sabar, and he then wrote up what her reaction to it was. And she expressed a kind of relief and calm that came from this new knowledge. Harvard themselves put up a statement on their website saying that they now thought that it was more likely to be a forgery. Disappointingly, they removed it soon afterwards, and they gutted the website and replaced all the lovely detail that I've talked about in the past with a kind of vanilla version. So in the show notes, what I've done is I've given some versions from archive.org of the older website, just so that you can see some of that detail, which is so helpful in diagnosing what's going on in the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. And this has been a bit of a personal journey through the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. I'm not attempting to be neutral or objective or anything like that. Well, I'm trying to be objective, but I'm not trying to be completely balanced and show it from every perspective. So how do I feel about this? Well, of course, on one level, it was nice to be right. I'm not going to pretend that it wasn't nice to be proved to be right, and that the early instincts, as well as the later research and the collaborations, were shown to be good. I particularly felt happy for Andrew Bernhard, who had done so much painstaking work and had been ignored by a lot of people. I just thought, this is really, really strong work, and really persuasive work. And you know, as an independent scholar, it is very difficult getting a hearing. So I really felt for him as well. But frankly, my overwhelming sense was just a sense of sadness about the whole affair. Sad that we'd wasted so much time. I wrote over 50 blog posts and wasted hours and weeks. I probably could have written a couple of good articles in that time. A couple more boring things on the synoptic problem. Maybe it's a good thing that I was kept away from those. But I think it's also incredibly sad when you see someone trying to deceive the Academy like this. And sad to see the owner targeting Karen King with this as well. But in the end, I suppose the scholarly community is a community, and the best way to support one another is to keep doing rigorous scholarship of the kind that did expose, in the end, the forgery of the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. Well, thanks very much for listening to this series on the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. We'll move on to something else next time. It's always good to have your company. You can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com, follow me on Twitter at goodacre, or visit the Facebook NT Pod page. Oh, Apple Podcasts is where you can get me to, Stitcher, any of those places. It's great to have your company. Do stay safe and well, and be sensible about isolating during this coronavirus pandemic. Be sensible. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.